Welcome to Reformed Thinking. So what if I told you the absolute darkest, most unjust crime in human history was not an accident?
Right, like it wasn't just a slip up.
Yeah, not a lapse in cosmic management, but actually planned down to the millisecond and totally governed by an absolute, unshakable authority.
It's a heavy thought.
It really is. Today, we are doing a deep dive into a stack of sources that tackle this precise collision. The mission for you, the listener, is to unpack a massive theological concept with us.
Which is the Christian doctrine of providence.
That's right. We're going to look at how a person can rest in God's absolute governance over the universe without demanding to know all of his hidden secrets.
Yeah, and it's a topic that is incredibly sweet, but also undeniably hard.
So hard. I mean, it brings immense comfort to know that nothing in your life is ruled by blind chance, right? Or demonic whim, autonomous human action.
But that comforting thought, well, it collides violently with the reality of human evil and the sudden tragedy and immense suffering we see in the world every single day.
Absolutely. It is the literal definition of a theological collision.
Yeah, and we're going to look at sources that synthesize these concepts today. Not to solve some, abstract philosophical puzzle for academics.
Right. We're not just doing mental gymnastics here.
No, not at all. The goal is to establish a rock of refuge for real life, to see how the scriptures provide both absolute certainty and distinct boundaries.
Meaning we get the truths we have to know to endure and worship, alongside the clear instruction that, hey, there are hidden workings we just don't need to understand.
Precisely. But before we look at the historical texts from the early church and the Apostle Paul, we really need to address the current cultural crisis.
Oh man, the cultural crisis regarding how people view God's authority. The modern evangelical landscape is facing a severe theological famine.
It's bad. The numbers on that famine are, frankly, alarming.
Yeah, our sources cite a Ligonier Ministries State of Theology survey. It reveals so much about what people actually believe in the pews right now.
And what did that data show?
Okay, so get this. According to their data, 48% of professing evangelicals in the United States agree with the statement. God learns and adapts to different circumstances.
Wow. Almost half.
Almost half. Half of the people surveyed believe that God is up there, reacting, learning new information as human history unfolds.
And then, adapting his plans accordingly.
Yeah. Let's just pause and think about what learning actually implies for a deity.
Right, because if you learn something, it means you were previously ignorant of it.
Spot on. So why is that specific statistic viewed by the authors of our sources as a catastrophic departure from historical orthodoxy?
Well, it's catastrophic because it completely overturns the historical adherence to absolute divine sovereignty, the very doctrine described in confessions from the Reformation era.
Because you're treating the creator of the universe like an improvising reactor.
Yeah, you're describing a deity who waits to see what humans will do and then formulates a response. It strips God of his omniscience.
His complete knowledge of all things past, present, and future.
Right. And it strips him of his omnipotence, which is his supreme strength and authority.
And the sources actually trace this modern view back to some pretty ancient errors, don't they?
They do. For instance, they mention Pelagianism.
Okay, unpack that for the listener. What is Pelagianism?
Sure. So, to put it simply, Pelagianism is a teaching from a 5th century monk named Pelagius. He argued that humans are born with a totally clean slate, spiritually speaking.
So no inherited sinful nature.
Right. He taught that people can just pull themselves up by their own moral bootstraps to choose God, without any special divine assistance.
So basically, human nature is neutral.
Yeah.
And we are the decisive factor in our own salvation.
That's the idea. And the sources also mention Arminianism, which originated in the 17th century.
And how does that differ?
Well, it argued that while God does offer grace, human free will has the final veto. So in that view, the human choice is the final deciding factor.
Got it. And today, those older ideas kind of manifest in modern movements, right? Like open theism.
Yeah, open theism is a big one. It argues that the future does not actually exist yet. So naturally, not even God can know it.
That is wild.
I know. According to this view, God is up in heaven guessing, taking risks, reacting to our choices just like we are reacting to our circumstances.
Which just elevates human autonomy to such a high position. It completely compromises divine sovereignty.
The creator who decrees all things from the beginning gets replaced by, A celestial middle manager.
Right, a middle manager who is constantly adjusting to the unpredictable choices of his creatures. And the consequences of that view are just massive when you apply it to real life.
Oh, absolutely. How does it play out practically?
Well, if God is just adapting to human choices, he cannot actually guarantee the promise found in Romans 8, right? That all things work together for good.
He can't promise that if he doesn't control all things.
Right. An adapting God offers zero comfort in the face of sudden tragedy or malicious persecution.
Because if a drunk driver crosses the center line, or a corrupt government decides to persecute believers,
An adapting God is just watching it happen, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation after the fact. I actually think about it like a GPS navigation system.
oh, that's a good analogy. How so?
The modern adapting view of God is like a GPS that is constantly saying recalculating every time you make a wrong turn. You have the wheel, you're driving wherever you want,
And God is just the voice on the dashboard.
frantically trying to draw a new route based on your autonomous decisions.
Hmm.
But the biblical view presented in these texts is that God is the architect. He designed the entire map, the roads, the vehicle, and the destination long before the journey ever began.
That GPS analogy illustrates the mechanism perfectly, because if God is just recalculating, then he does not have supreme authority over the evil that erupts in the world.
And if he doesn't have authority over the evil, he cannot offer genuine comfort when you are suffering through it.
Which is key. The sources highlight that people stumble over God ordaining sinful choices far more than they stumble over him ordaining righteous choices.
Of course they do. It's a tough pill to swallow.
It is. However, if the Bible demonstrates that God's providence covers even the darkest, most wicked human actions, then the case for his providence over everything else becomes an unshakable fortress.
We really have to cast aside the philosophical assumptions of secular modernism, the ones that insist God must step back and allow complete human self-determination.
Yeah, we do.
But I want to stop right there and ask a question that I know you, the listener, are probably thinking.
Go for it.
Because if we look at basic everyday logic, the modern world insists that humans must possess total self-determination for their choices to be justly praised or blamed.
Right. The philosophical term often used for that is libertarian free will.
Yeah, which basically means that for a choice to be truly free, you must have been able to choose the exact opposite under the absolute identical circumstances.
That's the definition, yes.
So isn't that just rational thought? I mean, how can a court of law or God himself find fault with someone if that person is not the autonomous author of their choice? If God drew the map and designed the route, how is the driver responsible for the crash?
That is probably the most common objection out there, and the authors of our sources anticipate it directly.
What's their answer?
The answer lies in separating human philosophical assumptions from biblical revelation.
Okay, break that down.
Well, the assumption that libertarian free will is essential for moral accountability is just that, a philosophical construct. It's a limitation placed upon God by finite human logic.
So we're assuming that because we can't synthesize absolute sovereign governance with true moral responsibility in our own minds, God can't do it either.
Spot on. The scriptures require us to recognize the flaw in that logic. The Bible teaches a concept called compatibilism.
Compatibilism. Okay, tell us about that.
It's the idea that absolute divine sovereignty and true human moral responsibility are completely compatible. They coexist without canceling each other out.
So we don't need to comprehend the precise metaphysical mechanics of how God governs sinful choices without turning humans into mindless robots.
No, we don't. We only need to know that he does govern them and that he remains entirely just in doing so.
Which is a huge paradigm shift. And to see how the early church handled this precise tension practically, we have to look at their first major crisis in the book of Acts.
Let's walk through that historical crucible. The texts take us to Acts chapter 4.
Yeah. To appreciate what is happening here, we have to set the scene. Peter and John are at the temple, specifically at a place called the Beautiful Gate.
And they've just healed a man who had been lame from birth.
Right. And this creates an absolute scene. A massive crowd gathers, and Peter and John use the commotion as an opportunity to preach the resurrected Christ.
Which is a bold move.
Very bold,
Yeah.
because it gets them immediately arrested by the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of the Jews.
And the texts point out a chilling historical detail here.
Oh, this part gave me goosebumps. The leaders of this council, Annas and Caiaphas, are the precise men who maliciously orchestrated the crucifixion of Jesus just months earlier.
It's wild. So Peter and John are standing there, staring down the literal murderers of their Savior.
Facing severe threats of violence, The psychological and historical tension in that room must have been staggering
Unbelievable. And you have the Sadducees involved here, too. The sources describe the Sadducees as the theological liberals of their day.
because they belonged to the wealthy aristocratic elite who ran the temple complex, right?
Yeah. Theologically, they rejected anything supernatural. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in demons. And crucially, they entirely rejected the concept of a bodily resurrection.
Which makes Peter's sermon a direct hit.
Absolutely. They also held the political might, maintaining a delicate, compromised peace with Rome just to keep their authority.
So when Peter and John stand in the temple preaching a physical resurrection of a man, the Sadducees just executed.
It is a direct assault on their entire doctrinal foundation and their political authority.
So upon their release, under these severe threats, the church's response is incredibly revealing.
What did they do?
Well, they didn't form a political action committee. They didn't resort to pragmatic church growth strategies.
Or retreat into some seeker-sensitive model to avoid offending the hostile culture.
No. They went back to the gathered believers and prayed a deeply theological prayer. They plunged straight into historical theology and biblical providence.
They needed to make sense of the terrifying existential threat staring them right in the face.
And I just love how the sources break down the specific Greek syntax of that prayer in Acts 4.24 through 30. It's a masterclass in theology.
Let's look at the words they used.
First, they address God as despota. In English, we hear the word despot and automatically think of a cruel tyrant, right? A dictator.
Yeah, it has a terrible connotation today, but the texts clarify the Greek usage here. In the original language, despota denotes an absolute monarch.
An unquestionable owner who possesses total rights over his creation.
Right, they're addressing the absolute sovereign creator of the universe, affirming his complete ownership of the situation before they even voice a single request.
That's such a grounding way to pray. And then they immediately quote Psalm 2, identifying Jesus as the fulfillment of the anointed king who faces the futile rebellion of the nations.
They look at the Sanhedrin, the Roman authorities, the hostile crowds,
And they categorize them all as the heathen raging against the Lord's Christ.
which leads directly to the crucial vocabulary of the passage, specifically in verse 28.
Yes, this is where it gets really deep. The early church prays, acknowledging that these enemies were gathered together to do whatever God's hand and counsel predetermined to occur.
And that word predetermined is fascinating in the Greek.
It is. The Greek word used is perizo. The authors explain that the root of this word horizo was actually used in ancient Greco-Roman property disputes.
Like marking land.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Spot on. It described the physical act of driving pegs into the ground to mark out the unalterable boundaries of an estate.
Oh, wow. And the prefix pro means before.
Right. So, before time began, God drove the pegs into the ground, marking out the clear boundaries of history.
That paints such a vivid picture. And the subjects performing this predestination are God's hand, representing his omnipotent action, and his counsel, representing his wise purpose.
So the crucifixion was the result of the unbreakable union of infinite wisdom and unstoppable strength.
Yeah. Look closely at the list of bad actors mentioned in Acts 4.27. You have Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel.
A whole coalition of enemies.
They all conspired against Jesus. Every single one of them acted out of their own sinful motivations.
Right. Pilate acted out of political cowardice. The religious leaders acted out of envy. The crowds acted out of mob mentality.
Yet the text explicitly states they did whatever God's hand and counsel predetermined to take place.
Okay, let me ask a follow-up question on that, because this is where the friction really starts for people.
Let's hear it.
Does the word perizo simply mean that God, in his infinite omniscience, looked down the corridor of time, foresaw the wicked choices these men would autonomously make, and then planned his redemptive strategy around them?
Like he was just anticipating their moves.
Yeah. Was he just playing a perfect game of chess in response to their opening moves?
The authors provide a categorical rejection of that idea. That concept is often termed prescience, or simple foreknowledge.
Why is that rejected?
Because if God only foresaw what Pilate and Herod would do, and then reacted to it, then he left the salvation of humanity up to the capricious whims of a Roman governor and a Judean tetrarch.
Oof. When you put it like that, it sounds terrifying.
It does. The biblical text completely destroys the concept of total human self-determination here. The cross was not an accident foreseen, it was a destiny foreordained.
The conspiracy of those wicked men was the precise mechanism God predestined to occur.
Right, and the theological distinction to make here is between primary and secondary causes.
Let's unpack that. Primary and secondary causes.
God is the primary cause, decreeing that the event will certainly happen. But he uses humans as secondary causes. He fully utilized their wicked intentions to accomplish his redemptive plan.
And he did so while preserving their guilt. They acted according to their own wicked desires.
Yeah.
No one forced Pilate to be a coward. No one forced the Pharisees to be envious.
Absolutely. But those desires were sovereignly utilized to fulfill the exact boundaries of God's script. Pilate and Herod were held entirely accountable for their actions, yet they did what the hand and counsel of God had marked out beforehand.
Okay, so if Acts 4 establishes this historical reality that God ordained the darkest human sin, the murder of the sinless Son, to bring about the greatest good, the conversation logically moves to how this is defended theologically.
Right. How do we defend the justice of it?
Yeah. If God drove those pegs into the ground, how on earth is it fair to punish the people who are just acting within those boundaries?
Which brings us to the Apostle Paul and his letter to the Romans.
Specifically, chapter 9. The deep dive shifts to Romans 9.14 through 24. Paul anticipates the precise, instinctive human objection we just discussed.
He writes, "Is there unrighteousness with God?"
And Paul's answer is an emphatic, categorical denial. He says, by no means.
Now, to really grasp Paul's argument, the sources set a vital historical backdrop that we just cannot ignore.
Set the stage for us. What's happening in Rome?
Paul is writing this letter in the late 50s of the first century to the church in Rome, and this church is dealing with severe Jewish and Gentile tension.
Why so much tension?
Because the Roman Emperor Claudius had previously expelled all the Jews from Rome in AD 49. When the Jewish believers left, the Gentile believers naturally occupied positions of greater visibility and leadership within the house churches.
Right. They had the run of the place for a while.
Exactly. Spot on. Then Claudius dies in AD 54, the edict is lifted, and the Jewish Christians return. You can imagine the massive cultural and theological clash that resulted.
Oh, absolutely. But beyond the local church politics, there was a burning, agonizing pastoral crisis.
What were they struggling with?
The Jewish Christians are wondering, if Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, why are all these Gentiles believing while our own ethnic people are largely rejecting him?
Has God's word failed?
Did God make a promise to Israel that he cannot keep? That's the burning question. And Paul answers this by looking through the lens of covenant history.
He doesn't point to human free will as the decisive factor, does he?
No, he points to God's sovereign election, specifically focusing on the historical figures of Moses and Pharaoh.
The examples of Moses and Pharaoh are so striking. Paul looks at Moses and quotes God saying, "I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy."
The sources make a crucial point here that we often miss. Mercy is a gift, not a wage.
Right. By definition, mercy cannot be demanded.
If you can claim something as a right or as a wage for your good actions, it completely ceases to be mercy. It is a gracious bestowal from the Creator.
And then Paul looks at Pharaoh. This is where it gets really intense for the modern reader.
It really does. The text says God raised Pharaoh up specifically to display divine might and fame.
Pharaoh's stubbornness wasn't just a random phenomenon that God later converted into a teaching moment.
The sources explain that hardening is a judicial action upon a sinner.
That distinction is paramount, and it really requires careful explanation.
Let's do it. What does hardening mean here?
When God hardens a heart, he is not taking an innocent person who wants to do the right thing and forcing them to be evil against their will.
Not at all.
Hardening confirms and deepens a rebellion that is already present in fallen humanity. God is not the author of fresh evil in the heart of Pharaoh.
He is judicially handing Pharaoh over to the stubbornness that Pharaoh already deeply desires.
Yeah. This pairing of Moses and Pharaoh proves God's absolute freedom. He has the sovereign right to show mercy, which is entirely unmerited.
And he has the sovereign right to harden, which is a just judicial response to sin. Both actions are ordered toward the public manifestation of his authority and the publication of his name across the earth.
Paul defends the righteousness of God in the actual unfolding of salvation history, proving that divine freedom is not some novel concept Paul just invented.
It's the very way God has dealt with humanity from the beginning. All right, let's walk straight into Romans 9.110, because Paul knows what his readers are going to ask next. He anticipates the pushback.
He plays the devil's advocate.
Yeah, he writes, "You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will?"
It is the exact question we raised earlier.
It is. If God's will is the decisive factor, and he hardens whom he wills and has mercy on whom he wills, it feels like human accountability completely collapses right here.
The logic seems undeniable to us. If I cannot resist the boundary pegs God drove into the ground, how can he blame me for staying within them?
It is a brilliant rhetorical move by Paul, because he voices the complaint that dresses itself up in logical respectability while concealing a deep rebellion of the heart against the Creator.
The authors emphasize that Paul does not soften the truth to resolve the tension for the reader.
Notice what he does not do. He does not say, well, you misunderstand, God doesn't really find fault.
Nor does he say, God's will isn't actually decisive, you have libertarian free will.
He holds both realities in full view. God's will is effective, and man remains fully accountable.
Instead of submitting God to creaturely judgment, Paul rebukes the posture of the questioner. He asks, "Who are you, O man, to answer back to God?"
And then he introduces the famous analogy of the potter and the clay, asserting that the maker has absolute authority over the lump of clay to fashion one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use.
That potter and clay analogy restores the creator-creature distinction in a very blunt, unvarnished way.
It really points out that we are not self-originating beings who have the standing to summon God to the bar of our human reason. The Creator has inherent rights over the creation.
This tension between God's effective will and human accountability brings up the concept of compatibilism again.
Right, these two seemingly opposing realities coexist. And this leads us to examine what we are actually meant to know versus what God intentionally keeps hidden from us as a secret.
The texts draw a firm, bright line between what Scripture reveals and what it keeps hidden. They reference Deuteronomy 29:29.
The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us.
We are given sufficient revelation for faith and obedience. We know that God is absolutely holy and without sin.
We know that mercy is completely free. We know that judicial hardening is real. And we know that human accountability remains entirely intact.
What we do not need to know, and what Scripture refuses to provide, is the metaphysical mechanism of how God's eternal decree and human volition interrelate in every single historical instance.
We don't need a tidily solved philosophical equation to trust the character of God.
No, we don't. The sources discuss a concept called the asymmetry of divine causality, which helps clarify this tension tremendously.
Let's look into that asymmetry. What does it mean?
It means God's orchestration of good and his orchestration of evil are not morally equivalent.
Okay, so when God shows mercy, it's a direct, gracious bestowal. He actively works in the human heart to produce the good.
But when he hardens or ordains an evil act, he does so indirectly. It is a judicial action that removes restraint and confirms the rebellion already present.
God can see to it that sin happens without himself sinning.
And the authors use a brilliant analogy here to explain the mechanism, comparing God's providence over evil to a nuclear engineer handling radioactive uranium.
Oh man, it is a highly effective illustration. Uranium is incredibly dangerous. It's deadly.
Left unmanaged, it causes radiation poisoning and widespread destruction.
But nuclear engineers know how to build a reactor with control rods, heavy water, and massive containment vessels.
They manipulate the radioactive material to generate electricity for an entire city without getting poisoned themselves.
The sources argue that if finite, fallible human beings can engineer ways to handle highly radioactive material, manipulating it to produce useful, necessary energy without contaminating themselves in the process, then surely the infinitely wise God can handle the deadly radioactive evil of human sin.
He directs it to bring about his holy redemptive purposes without suffering any moral contamination himself.
God's holiness remains unimpeachable even as his providence governs explicitly sinful acts.
He manages the uranium of human depravity to power the reactor of redemptive history, all while remaining perfectly pure.
But, if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, are we just supposed to shut our brains off then?
Are we embracing irrationalism when the math doesn't seem to add up to our finite minds?
Yeah. If we can't know the secret mechanism of how the primary and secondary causes perfectly align in every situation, do we just stop thinking altogether?
The authors explicitly clarify that this is not a call to irrationalism. It is a direct confrontation with human insolence.
Paul isn't telling the Roman Church to stop thinking. He's commanding them to stop judging God. There's a vast difference between a holy ignorance that fosters childlike trust and a skeptical demand for exhaustive comprehension.
The demand to have a complete philosophical explanation for every tragedy or to have a tidy answer for every theological tension is very often an expression of intellectual pride.
The creature wants mastery where he was made for trust. True wisdom recognizes the boundary of revelation. It walks right up to the edge of what God has spoken, and when it reaches the boundary of the unrevealed secret things, it bows in worship.
We know enough about his character to trust him fully, and we are told that we do not need to know more than he has revealed.
Moving from the theological heights down to the dirt and grime of everyday life, we need to focus on how this doctrine practically alters the way a listener lives, suffers, and prays.
Because the authors insist that the doctrine of providence is not an abstract puzzle for academics to debate in a classroom.
No, it is an apostolic instrument designed to humble, stabilize, and comfort the church in the trenches of real life. Let's look at the practical applications, starting with finding comfort in suffering.
The immediate practical application is that affliction is never random.
If God's providence is absolute, then no suffering enters a believer's life apart from fatherly wisdom.
The sources draw heavily on the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis here.
Joseph's life is a masterclass in the doctrine of providence. He was hated by his brothers, thrown into a pit, and sold to Midianite traders.
Taken to Egypt, sold to Potiphar, falsely accused of assault by Potiphar's wife, and thrown into a dungeon.
Forgotten by the cupbearer and left to rot for years.
Yet at the end of his life, looking his terrified brothers in the eyes, Joseph says, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good."
Notice the intentionality in that phrasing. He doesn't say, you did evil and God somehow managed to salvage it. He says God meant it for good from the very beginning.
Because if God does not rule over evil, he cannot offer comfort when evil erupts.
If a tragedy is outside of God's control, then it is truly chaotic, meaningless, and terrifying. But because he governs even the darkest moments, the believer is guarded against absolute despair.
The sources also apply this doctrine to how we view history and society today.
Yes, they specifically critique the modern impulse to interpret history entirely through human power dynamics or Marxist sociological frameworks like critical race theory.
The authors of our texts argue that viewing history merely as an endless, random series of societal clashes between the oppressors and the oppressed, driven solely by material forces, leaves humanity in a state of constant panic and anger.
These frameworks assume that human institutions are the final arbiters of reality.
But the biblical view of providence argues that history is governed by God's sovereign decrees.
True justice and historical meaning are found in understanding that God is orchestrating all events for his glory and the redemption of his people, not in endless secular struggles.
The authors use this doctrine to offer a completely different foundation for viewing the world. When you view society through the lens of absolute providence, you are freed from the panic of thinking that corrupt politicians or broken institutions have the final say over human destiny.
Another massive practical application the sources highlight is the grounding for prayer.
Which is funny, because a common objection is that if God is completely sovereign, there is no reason to pray.
Right. But the sources argue the exact opposite. If God were not sovereign over human hearts and historical outcomes, prayer would be a mere sentiment, a hopeful wish cast out into the void.
It would be a wager. We pray precisely because God governs outcomes.
We ask him to convert sinners, heal the sick, and restrain evil rulers, because he actually has the authority, the right, and the omnipotence to open hearts and alter physical events.
Providence does not weaken prayer. It is the very foundation that makes prayer rational and effective.
It also completely changes the way we approach evangelism and ministry. When you understand that salvation is dependent on God's sovereign mercy, not human free will, it rescues you from pride when you see fruit in your ministry.
You can't boast that your eloquent speech or your clever presentation saved someone. The pressure is off.
But equally, it rescues you from despair when you face hardness and rejection. You realize you are called to faithfully sow the seed, to speak the truth with love, but God alone gives the increase.
I look at this doctrine like a massive, load-bearing pillar in the middle of a building's floor plan.
A load-bearing pillar. I like that. How so?
Well, when you first walk in, it seems entirely in the way. It obstructs your view, it forces you to walk around it, and it feels like an offensive obstacle to human autonomy.
But if you try to remove that pillar, the entire roof caves in. The weight of the world's suffering and evil will crush you without it.
Once you understand its function, you stop trying to remove it and you start resting under the shelter it provides.
That is the pastoral goal of the texts we are analyzing. The obstacle becomes the rock of refuge. But to reach that point of rest, one must address a very common lingering fear, which leads to another objection.
The fear of fatalism.
Yes. A listener might ask, if God has already written the boundaries of history, if he has already driven the property pegs into the ground, why should I bother pleading with a rebellious friend to believe the gospel?
Why should I pray for a sick family member if the outcome is already locked in? Does this not lead to absolute apathy and a passive approach to life?
Right. And how do the authors counter that objection?
Forcefully, by pointing out a crucial biblical principle. The same God who ordains the end also ordains the means to achieve that end.
God predestined the salvation of his people, but he also predestined the fervent preaching of the gospel as the exact mechanism to gather them.
Look back at the early church in Acts 4. Knowing that God predestined the conspiracy against Jesus did not drive the apostles to apathy or silence.
They didn't sit in a room and say, well, God is sovereign, let's just wait and see what happens.
No, it drove them to pray for boldness, and they went out and preached aggressively in the temple courts.
Providence is a strong tower for obedience, not a pillow for laziness. Knowing that God guarantees the outcome is the very thing that gives you the courage to engage in the process, regardless of the opposition you face.
So as we bring this deep dive toward a conclusion, we need to summarize the core insight we have extracted from these texts.
The secret things belong to the Lord, but the revealed things belong to us. We have seen that the cross of Christ is the undeniable proof that divine sovereignty and divine goodness meet in perfect, blazing harmony.
The worst injustice in human history was the mechanism God used to purchase our salvation.
God's hand and counsel are always at work, executing his perfect will, even when the path looks incredibly dark and confusing to our finite eyes.
The sources continually point back to the cross as the final answer to human doubt. It is the guarantee that God is not a distant, unfeeling determinist.
The hands that govern the boundaries of human history, the hands that drove the pegs into the ground, are the very hands that were pierced for our transgressions.
We can trust the Father's absolute governance because we have seen the Son's absolute sacrifice.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on everything we have covered today.
Think about the most confusing, painful, or unresolved chapter of your own life.
The moments that make absolutely no sense to you, where the pain seems pointless and the tragedy feels random. If the absolute worst event in human history, the malicious, unjust crucifixion of the sinless Son of God, was utilized by God's hand and counsel to bring about the greatest salvation the world has ever known, how might viewing your own dark chapters through the lens of God's unsearchable holy governance entirely eliminate your fear of the future?
If God can handle the radioactive uranium of the cross and produce the light of the world, he can govern the messy, painful details of your life for your good and his glory.
Rest in that rock of refuge. You know enough to trust the Creator, even when you cannot trace his exact steps. Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking.